Hi, I'm Juanita Washington. I'm an Adult Protective Services Investigative Caseworker Supervisor, and I'm here today to provide a presentation on how APS and APD can work together. So Adult Protective Services is a division of the Aging and Long-Term Services Department. In Adult Protective Services arena, we have 5 different regions throughout the state. We have the Northwest, the Southwest, the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Metro. I'm representing the Metro region, which is Bernalillo County, Sandoval County, Torrance County, and part of Santa Fe, which is Edgewood. As a supervisor, I report to a regional manager by the name of Victor Hernandez, and then our Deputy Director for Adult Protective Services is Esperanza Lucero, and then our General Counsel is Anastasia Martin. Aging and Long-Term Services Department's mission is to provide accessible services to incapacitated adults to assist them in maintaining their independence and on their own terms and within their communities. And the vision of Adult Protective Services is to live lifelong independence with healthy aging for all adults. So Adult Protective Services provides a system of protective services and resources to persons over the age of 18 who are incapacitated and unable to protect themselves from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We work with victims, perpetrators, and families with diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds, and we partner with and educate the community like we're doing today. So reporting adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation. How do you do that? Well, first of all, you can contact our intake hotline, which is 1-866-654-3219. And for law enforcement, to reduce the wait time, you can hit prompt 4, and that should get you with an intake worker quicker. We also have our online web reporting, which is relatively new. You just go to our web page and then click on the link, and you can enter the information directly and upload any reports where you can attach your police report or anything else that you feel is important for us to look into to make a decision on a report. The main intake line is open Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 p.m. and then after hours it goes to an on-call worker who covers non-working hours and holidays. Everybody is a mandated reporter in the state of New Mexico, so any person having suspicion to believe that there's a victim of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, they are all mandated to report. So what is the criteria for Adult Protective Services report? So first and foremost, every victim must be 18 years and older. Secondly, the alleged victim must have an incapacitation. So what does incapacitation mean? It means an individual must have a mental, physical, or developmental condition which substantially impairs their ability to provide for their own care and protection. So a lot of people like to misinterpret incapacitation versus incompetent, which are 2 different meanings, and just a friendly reminder, only a judge can determine somebody to be incompetent. Thirdly, all reports must contain an allegation of abuse, neglect, exploitation, and even self-neglect. So abuse is physical pain, mental anguish, verbal abuse, and sexual abuse. Neglect can be from failure of a caregiver or a person acting in a caregiver role to provide for the basic needs of the adult, such as clothing, food, shelter, supervision. And this is where the individual, if they're their own caretaker, live on their own, this is where self-neglect would fall into place. And then, of course, there's exploitation, which is the use of the incapacitated adult's money, property for another individual's needs, personal gains, not for that of the alleged victim. And then we must have sufficient information to be able to locate the victim. This can be from a physical address where the individual lives in their apartment or home. If it's an individual who is experiencing homelessness and is a victim of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, we would need a location like, let's say they are known to hang out at McDonald's at Wyoming and Central, and you can provide us a description of them so we can determine who they are versus other people who are hanging out at the same situation. Just a note, mental health, substance abuse, and domestic violence and homelessness in of itself does not automatically constitute abuse or neglect. The alleged victim has to have an incapacitation as well. And then we have 3 priorities. Once a case is assigned for investigation, we have 3 different priorities for an investigative caseworker to respond. So we have an emergency report, which is the worker needs to make face-to-face contact with the alleged victim within 3 hours. A P1 report means the worker has 24 hours to make contact with the alleged victim. And then, of course, P2, which is where the investigative caseworker has 5 calendar days to make contact with the victim. And this includes the weekends. So what can Adult Protective Services do? So we investigate allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We always intervene in the least restrictive means possible. So what does this mean to somebody who's new to APS and what we do? So this means that if an individual is in their home and is maybe needing some caregiving services where they're receiving a caregiver a couple times a week to help maintain them independently in their home versus putting somebody into a nursing home who would restrict their ability to come and go, or eventually, if necessary, somebody who's completely incapacitated, has no decision makers, doing a guardianship. So we always least restrictive means of intervention as long as the individual is safe within their home. We initiate and coordinate services with clients' consent, so meaning everybody has to give us their okay for us to implement services for them, make referrals for them, or to even continue our investigation with them. We utilize law enforcement to gain access to the individual victim if needed. This would be where if we go out and do a home visit and the alleged perpetrator's in the home and they're preventing us from making contact with the victim, we would call 242 cops and ask for law enforcement assistance. Or we could also, a lot of times we have individuals who are bedridden, and we would then ask for law enforcement to help us gain access to the home if necessary, or obviously if we feel that there's somebody down in the home, we would call and ask for assistance to get in as well. And then we make a report to law enforcement as deemed necessary. So a lot of times as we conduct our investigations, we find that we really feel like a crime is being committed and a police report is warranted. So this could be from, an individual who is possibly being exploited and it's clear cut that their funds are being taken to the bank without the AV's permission. It can be from theft of their property, like the caregivers come in and taken several items for the home, as well as a sexual assault or rape. And then we share information as appropriate with agencies as allowed by law. So we share information obviously with law enforcement. We're doing joint investigations. When we're working with service providers in the community, such as care coordinators, or we're working with hospitals, we share information with social workers and doctors, and then other community agencies that we may be working referrals to provide assistance to the individuals that we are working with. So one of the most important things to remember when working with adult protective services is that adults have the right to self-determination. So APS fosters the rights of adults to make their own decisions. We cannot dictate, control, or impose our own personal beliefs and or values on other adults. They have the right to decide how they want to live their own life, and adults with capacity have the right to refuse an APS investigation and services offered by our department at any time. So self-determination is very important, as this is basically anybody's civil rights. And so meaning that we all have the right to make bad decisions. So just because it may be a bad decision doesn't mean that they don't have capacity to make that decision. So it's very important for us to assess the individual to make sure they have capacity, meaning that they have the ability to consent and understand the consequences and ability to communicate those informed decisions to us. And we have to respect their wishes, even if it's not something that we would agree with. So how does APS assess for decisional capacity? So all investigative caseworkers assigned to cases will assess the alleged victim for decisional capacity by conducting a couple of different assessments that we are required to conduct, as well as to check to see if the individual is alert and oriented to person, place, time, and situation. So again, remember, decisional capacity is the adult's ability to understand the nature and consequences of their decisions and their ability to communicate that to you. So this is how APS and law enforcement can work together, and this is a really important piece, as you guys are the eyes and ears in the community, and you see individuals usually a lot sooner than we do. So under the APS Act, there is a emergency protective placement by law enforcement without a court order. So what happens here is, let's say you get called out to a home, and based on your personal observation, if you have probable cause to believe that the incapacitated adult will suffer immediate and irreparable physical injury or death if they are not placed in a facility. And that adult does not seem to appear to have the ability to consent. And so due to this, it's an emergency situation or circumstances, and you are able to transport this individual to a facility. Now in the state of New Mexico, usually it's a hospital. And in this circumstance, no court order is required. And to authorize you to do this, you're basing this decision upon your observation. So once you transport the individual to the facility emergencies to ensure their safety, then you immediately call Adult Protective Services and make a report to us, notifying us of the placement. From there, then Adult Protective Services has 2 working days after the placement to determine if we still need to follow through with the emergency removal or placement, and if not, then we can not pursue the legal aspect. If we feel further involuntary protective placement is necessary, then we would file the necessary court orders. And then this is another part of the APS Act that we really need law enforcement assistance with at times, is that per the Adult Protective Services Act, each investigative caseworker, as they conduct a home visit, shall have immediate access to the alleged victim to assess their needs, their safety, as part of the number 1 goal, and verify the accuracy of the report. So anybody interfering with the APS investigation can be charged with a misdemeanor and a fine of $10,000. So this is where you and Adult Protective Services can work together for the safety and the well-being of our mutual clients. So next I want to talk to you about a few examples on cases where how law enforcement and APS can work together. So let's say we have an investigative caseworker who responds to a report regarding a 50-year-old bedridden alleged victim who has multiple sclerosis. Normally they have sufficient care, but for unforeseen reason, their caregiver quit. So the AV is not able to get out of bed on their own. They're alert and oriented, so they appear to have decisional capacity, but with no other natural supports, no care. Now the AV is bedridden, where they are urinating and defecating on themselves in the bed. So this report comes into us through some source who has knowledge to this environment. And when we get to the home, the worker realizes since the individual's bedridden, there's really no way for us to get access to the individual in the home. And so we're able to call 242 cops and ask for assistance with gaining access to the victim. When law enforcement arrives, they are able to reach the victim by phone, who gives them permission to gain entry to the home. And once we do so, then we just proceed with our investigation. What is the alleged victim's wants? What does he want to do? How can we solve this issue that he's not home alone, no longer receiving services? And then, as I mentioned before, the other way that we would work together is if we're out of home, which happens frequently, and the alleged perpetrator is very upset that we're there and that there's allegations against them, and therefore they don't want us allow us access to interview the alleged victim. And so we may call you to assist, stand by, where you can talk with the AP while we're able to engage the AV and discuss the situation with them. And then another case where we've used APD is where we had a case where there was an elderly woman who resided with her daughter, and the daughter was her primary caregiver and her power of attorney. The alleged victim was bedridden on hospice, and her dementia was so advanced that she did not have decisional capacity. So the hospice nurse arrived to the home to provide services for the day, and nobody answered the door, which was unusual because the daughter never left her mom alone. And the nurse continued to try to knock on the door, and there was a small window next to the door where the nurse could peek into to see if she could see anybody in the home. And what she noticed was that she could see what appeared to be an individual down in the living room area. So she continued to knock on the glass on the door and noticed that the person who was on the floor did appear to move. So she called out to this person who appeared to motion the nurse in. The nurse checked, and thank goodness the door was unlocked. She hollered out to her. There was some moans. So she went ahead and entered the home. And what the nurse observed is it appeared that the daughter had fallen as a result of some type of medical episode. At the time, the nurse assumed, based on the daughter's inability to speak, that it was a stroke. So she immediately called 911. EMS arrived, was able to assess the daughter, who was unable to communicate due to the stroke, and they were getting ready to transport her. But as they were getting ready to transport her, the nurse had to caution them and say, hey, there's a bedridden individual who lacks capacity in the bedroom, in a hospital bed. We can't leave her here alone. So law enforcement, of course, assisted. Again, understanding that the lady lacked decisional capacity, and was able to immediately agree with the assistance of EMS that, she could not be left alone. And so she was transported to the hospital along with her daughter. Once they arrived at the hospital, APD called and notified us of the report. We assigned the report as an emergency. The investigative caseworker went to the hospital. When she arrived, the daughter was still unable to communicate due to the stroke. And again, the victim herself lacking capacity. So it was determined through a staffing with the investigative caseworker, the investigative caseworker supervisor, the regional manager, their deputy director, and the APS attorney that an affidavit for an emergency placement, and with the assistance of hospice, the individual was able to be placed into a nursing facility. So with all this in mind, this is how adult protective services and law enforcement can work together. And we encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments where you're not able to get through to the intake, or if you just have certain questions in regards to case scenarios. Again, my name is Juanita Washington, and I will be the APD liaison for the Metro region. If you need any questions, my phone number is on the slide, as well as my email. Thank you.